Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
Many people have said to me, the Profiteers, that sounds very different than Better Business, which was the B Corp title. They are actually more related than you might think. Basically, the underlying thesis of both is that business has a huge and important and powerful role to play in the world for social and environmental good, but there's very strong headwinds in many cases. And how to actually help business get around those headwinds is really where I focus a lot of my attention. And in this Profiteers, I really examine much more like what are a lot of the systemic features of the economy and society that actually make it a challenge for business to do good.
That was Chris Marquis, the Sinyi Professor at the University of Cambridge Judge School of Business. Chris writes a regular column for Forbes, and his work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Foreign Policy, Harvard Business Review. He's also the author of two other books, other than the one that we're going to talk about today. One is Better Business, How the B Corp is Remaking Capitalism. We had him on this podcast last year to talk about that book, and Mao and the Markets, which made the Financial Times Best Book of 2022 list. We love Chris's work, and we've invited him back because his work is so well researched, it's balanced, and it delivers actionable, thoughtful, and often counterintuitive advice. He takes on topics that are or should be important to companies and to society. In this episode, we dive into concepts from his newest book, The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. In that book, we're going to talk about a few topics. One is the underlying premise that drove him to write that book, which is simply the fact that companies often pass on the hidden negative cost of their business operations onto society and the environment while keeping the benefit and profits for themselves. And importantly, why that is changing now, thanks to broad systemic changes underway with investors, consumers, employees, and governments. Evidence that a group of pioneers that are taking action to minimize their negative impacts are turning that into competitive advantage. Upcoming policy changes that business strategists should keep in top of mind that will impact all businesses, and how jumping on this curve early will serve to potentially reward those who do. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Marquis.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for being back on the podcast. We are eager to get you to share the content of this next book. You know, last time we talked about the B Corporation and the movement, and you very quickly out of the gates came up with this other book. I know you've been working on it for a while, but just tell us, how did you decide to look at this topic?
Yeah, there's a couple things. And so, many people have said to me, the Profiteers, that sounds very different than Better Business, which was the B Corp title. And, they are actually more related than you might think. Basically, the underlying thesis of both is that, business has a huge and important and powerful role to play in the world for social and environmental good, but there's very strong headwinds in many cases. And how to actually help business get around those headwinds is really where I focus a lot of my attention. And in this Profiteers, I really examine much more like what are a lot of the systemic features of the economy and society that actually make it a challenge for business to do good. And so it sounds a little more critical, but actually the underlying message is not that different.
That's great. So you're kind of addressing the issue not by asking businesses to act against their self-interest,
right,
but you are looking at what are the system designs that create,
And I do dive in a lot into actually how can business sort of innovate and in some ways be looking around the corner. And I think that as strategists, which I know your audience is a lot of, that's actually what the main role is. Like, how can you see what's going to be coming next? And I do think that the last 50 years and the next 50 years might actually look fundamentally different. And so thinking about maybe the constraints that have really limited how business can engage with communities and societies and the environment, I think we're going to need to be breaking out of that really, because of one issue is it's increasingly obvious with climate damage, with challenges around inequality, that, governments, consumers, investors are probably going to be demanding more of companies. And if you want to be competing in this next phase, the issues of how to be an innovative and effective company with an environmental and social mission, I think will be tremendously impactful.
I want to unpeel that, but maybe we start first with the costs, right? So you cover that there are costs that we don't know of or that are external, and who pays for them is maybe not the entities that actually create them. You talk about carbon emission, damage to the earth, cheap goods, cheap labor. Which would you like to start with?
I'll start in general, I guess, in some ways. And so, the subtitle of the book is, how business privatizes profit and socializes cost, which really probably encapsulates the theme of the book a little better than even the main title, The Profiteers. That actually describes a concept in economics called an externality, which are, costs to society or the environment that are sort of from business or some other entity, but that actually the business is not responsible for. And why I think it's important to think about these is that for, I guess time immemorial, possibly, these externalities happen. Carbon emissions is probably the most famous of these nowadays. Business for decades plus centuries now, I guess, has been spewing carbon into the atmosphere. For most of that time, the air is sort of a free entity, free landfill. In recent decades, there's been increasing regulations, a lot of discussions now, things like, carbon taxes, carbon markets. And those are ways to actually internalize, have businesses internalize those costs. I mean, so that's one example, but actually it's, this is something that's really pervasive. One of the stories that really resonated with me when I was doing research, actually following my first book, Better Business, it was a company called Grove Collaborative, who, produces, markets, sells, home goods like, soaps, shampoos, hand washing liquid. And the CEO told me, the biggest externality of our business is plastic. And I need to be thinking about how to actually reduce plastic if I'm going to be a socially responsible company. I never thought of actually companies thinking about externalities as part of their social mission until that entrepreneur told me this. And what he meant by this, and I'd never even thought about plastic as an externality either. I mean, obviously, plastic waste is a problem, in our world, that we see these sort of clumps in the ocean and lots of sort of plastic disposable issues. But to use virgin versus non-virgin plastic is cheaper because it's easier to work through machines. So that's sort of one example where, if you make the choice for price, actually because it's actually very, damaging the environment, because plastic is made through petrochemicals to produce plastic, but then also, just the choice of, using products out of plastic, because after it goes to the factory gates, the company has no cost for it. So it doesn't get recycled, sadly. I mean, we all are sort of sorting our plastic into bins these days, but I think it's become increasingly known actually most of that plastic does not get recycled. So this is another area where this is something where companies can make choices for cost, but actually it's the society and the environment that end up paying for that. So a reason why I think this is so important, and a lot of the examples I give in the book are not criticisms of these who pays, but actually how thinking deeply about it can sort of unlock innovation and new thinking. So the CEO, Stu Landsberg is his name, just told me, he said, when we sort of shifted to really think about really trying to reduce plastic as our key responsibility, it enabled us to think about ways of reformulating our products. And so now they have bar shampoos as opposed to liquid shampoos. And this has been a product category that they pioneered and have won awards for, and they've really gained as a result of this. They've created a lot of new business process innovations. So they created an internal carbon tax So for P&Ls within their company, their business leaders have to be thinking about that as part of their, as they're developing and rolling out products. And then also recently created a badging system for products on their website, because they don't just sell their products. They actually have a marketplace that sells like Seventh Generation, Mrs. Myers, Dr. Bronner, sort of responsible companies in their category. So the consumers can actually understand how their choices, how plastic is part of the choices they make. So I think this idea of actually considering the core impact of the company is a way to actually also unlock innovation. And in the future, this is something that's going to be hugely important for producers. And because, governments are taking an increasing scrutiny on this, consumers are going to be interested in this, and also, just to be responsible as a business.
So what I'm hearing you say is that these externalities are going to become internalized. And so companies have to be preparing for that. And by the way, doing it now, even if under the current system, those externalities are not hit their bottom line, there are benefits of doing it now, because out of necessity comes innovation. Innovation can lead to better products, can lead to healthier companies.
Totally. Exactly. That's the exact message. Yeah.
Got it. I love it. What are some of the factors that are driving, like I'm imagining a strategist sitting with leadership and saying, look, I know this doesn't impact our GAAP accounting based profit, which our investors measure us on when we do our earnings announcement next quarter, but these externalities are going to come in. What's going to cause that to happen?
So one of the things that I think is going to be a game changer in many ways around accountability on these issues is a lot of the laws that are being currently implemented and introduced in the EU. So the folks in your network and your listeners may be aware of these. One of the biggest ones is called CSRD, which is Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This actually, for large European companies, is actually 2024 data they're going to have to be reporting on in 2025. And if many people from the U.S., the U.S. SEC recently went through a process and was criticized by some of the environmental movement for really watering down the environmental accountability for companies. But actually, CSRD, I know policy stuff can get a little boring, but I do think because I think it's going to be coming, it's important to discuss a bit. There's a couple aspects of it that I think are really crucial to understand as companies are looking forward. So one is around materiality. So traditionally, these corporate accountability systems have focused on financial materiality. This actually has what is known as double materiality, as impact materiality. So things that are actually beyond what might have a financial bottom line impact actually are, companies are going to be actually accountable to report on. Companies can be held legally liable if they're not accurate on this. So the directors and managers can be sued and have, legal repercussions on this. So whereas so much reporting in the past has been voluntary, this will be mandatory, and, at the level of like financial reporting, they can be held legally liable. And I think the thing that is most compelling about this is that actually the way the EU designed this to be rolled out is that virtually all large companies in the world are going to be subject to this, because it's by like 2028, data, it's going to be required for basically any company of pretty medium size that does business in the EU and their entire parent company. So if you're, Nike, for instance, which is actually a large business, so but it's one that people know, I'm sure Nike has an EU subsidiary. It won't just be the EU subsidiary that has to report, but they're going to be actually on the line for Nike Global. So I think all of these areas suggest that, these issues are things that companies are going to need to be very, very aware of. Governments are going to be scrutinizing them. They're going to be held liable for them. And, this really means that, it's not going to be like in the past. I have a huge respect for the GRI, SASB, all these different systems that were put in place, but they're voluntary. And I think because they were voluntary and there was not really any sort of legal bite, people might not have actually paid as much attention to them. I think this next phase is going to be very, very different. And so, your CFO strategists, I think, are going to need to be working on how to actually get their head around, what the business actually is doing in these realms. And I should also note it's scope 3. So that's refers mainly to supply chain people typically think about. So companies will need to be gathering this data from their extended supply chain, and probably will in the future will be considering these items when they're actually choosing suppliers. So it's going to be a game changer, I think.
So do you think then that we'll start seeing competition between regions? I wonder how that evolves. Like in the United States, we got California versus Texas. They have very different policies, and their goal is to, whatever they're optimizing for individually. But how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, a lot of times that's something governments are really very much worried about. Like, okay, will this just drive companies to other locations? And I think the EU is in all of its environmental regulations, has been very, very thoughtful in designing it in a way that actually it'll raise the floor for the entire world. It won't just sort of push people out. So one sort of related example to that is, they have this thing called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, this is where, if you in certain industries, and there's some sort of phase-in schedule where it's sort of increasing the types of industries that are under scope. But like, let's say you're a steel producer in China and you want to actually have your steel used in the EU, you have to pay a carbon adjustment because European steel makers are subject to carbon taxes, but Chinese steelmakers are not. So this is one way it sort of equalizes.
Yeah.
But another thing that is really important, and this relates to the supply chain aspect of it. So it's not just the where the companies are located. But for instance, I was in Malaysia at the end of this past year, 2023. And I was there talking to like YPO groups and giving a conference at a university. And one of the trade ministers sort of summoned me to his office. He had heard that I was in Kuala Lumpur, and then I had done some work on sort of corporate accountability. And Malaysia as a country actually has decided that with this new incoming, sort of European program, this is a way for them to actually leapfrog many other countries as a supplier for European companies. So
they can be more competitive by getting ahead of. I see.
So he was in the process of working through, Malaysia, so many small, medium-sized enterprises that are in these, extended supply chains, and working through how they could create a program for their small, medium-sized enterprises to both assess themselves on ESG matters and then also improve. So, they were developing a small grants program to actually develop some consulting expertise in the country to actually help their small, medium-sized enterprises on these topics so they'd be more competitive to the European companies now that this new regulation is in place.
That's great. And I guess, Europe has a lot of power because it represents a very valuable market, very valuable audience. And they're sort of saying, if you want access to this audience, then this is what you have to do. Do you foresee then any regions doing the opposite, being we're going to be the polluters? This is where you can come and do,
Well, I think the U.S. is a little bit not in a strong way, although certain regions of the U.S. or states are taking a little stronger position on sort of whether they want companies to be or investors to be focused on ESG or not. But the thing is that I know there's been deglobalization in recent years, but at the large company or even medium-sized company level, I think there's still a tremendous amount through supply chains, through actually companies trying to do business in other countries. There's incredible density in the global networks. And so my sense is that it's very different than the past where, you could do this sort of race to the bottom in your, just go and find factories and offshore the pollution. I think that, the way that the EU has designed this, and California actually has some similar type of laws that they're putting in place, that it's going to be hard for companies to really escape a lot of this accountability.
Okay. So talk to us a little about this system. You talked about governments just now, and you just say also there's consumers and investors. What's the causality between that? Like, for example, I mean, my not very deeply educated view is consumers don't pay a margin, aren't really willing to pay a margin for better business, but they do vote. So maybe they are influence the governments, and that's what does it. What's the causality between those three agents? Or
I think I would agree with you. I mean, I think, my thinking probably on this has changed over time. There's been decades of like surveys that say people will buy green, and now we have millennials and Gen X's. And I think, I don't know if I agree with that anymore. I think that it's very much wishful thinking. I think that while people in general maybe do have that interest, I think that there's been so many large companies over the years that have learned just very sophisticated sort of production and marketing techniques. So I'm thinking like in the fashion business, Shein. There's a lot of people that are buying this fast fashion that is environmentally hugely destructive. I'm sure
shipping, flying stuff really quickly across great distances.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that the consumers, maybe voting might be a good way that the average person is going to have an impact. I think actually companies, sort of social mission companies play a very big role here. I don't think this is something where we're going to change through voluntary action, but I do think, like, I mentioned Grove Collaborative, and there are, my experience with entrepreneurs and corporate leaders is that they actually, many of them want to really they want to do the right environmental thing. And there's so much innovation in the area. And I see business really and entrepreneurs providing tremendous innovation.
Just maybe an example of that. Like people often will say, oh, we want to be the Apple of real estate or whatever that is, right? What is the blank of blank? What's an exemplar company that has this regenerative business model that is doing the right thing that we can learn for? I think if we can create an example of, hey, they're doing the right thing and they're more competitive because of it.
Well, I mean, the most well-known example, and I know you don't YouTube this either, but I'm wearing a Patagonia jacket right now. I mean, so Patagonia is I think a great example of this, and maybe it's too much of a good example, but I think for this purpose, maybe I'll say a little bit about it because they are one of the companies that I did spend some time doing some research with for the book. And I think particularly around, you mentioned the word regenerative, and I think that is actually, I think, going to be a much more important word in the future too. So sure. For decades now, we've been talking about sustainability. You have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but sustainability for a long time has been really very much about do less harm. Ideas of regeneration are about actually how to repair, restore, actually have, through business production, making the world better. And this is something, and I think Patagonia is a really important example because actually, they had a light bulb moment on this, and let me say a little bit about. So Patagonia, as you may know or may not know, because it's not a big part of their business, actually is in the food business. Yeah, they have a product line called Patagonia Provisions. And this, they do a variety of sort of naturally and regeneratively produced food products. They have actually some very good beer that is produced through a regeneratively produced grain called Kenza, I think it's called, which is sort of interesting. So this is a grain that actually, when actually grown, gives more back to the soil and biodiversity environment than actually takes from it. And what I learned from the leaders of Patagonia when I was researching them for the book, they said, when we got into Patagonia Provisions, we realized that actually we could have a positive influence on the world, not just actually an extractive one like so much of business is. And at the time, Patagonia's mission statement was, had the clause in it like, and do no unnecessary harm. And they said, we realized by saying that, we were acknowledging in our mission statement that we were doing harm.
We do harm.
That we do harm.
Right.
And they're like, this is crazy. I mean, our business is all about the environment, and we're acknowledging in our mission statement that we do harm. So they totally underwent a long process, and they changed their mission statement to, we're in business to save our home planet. if you think about, so I think that what's really important, and we talked a bit about this with this scope 3 idea, which is about like really the parts of the value chain that are really outside the direct control of the company. You think about like upstream, like how do you influence sort of upstream? I mean, it's sort of through your purchasing and materials. And so they made a real conscious effort around, regenerative cotton and regenerative other materials. And I think that where the Patagonia case is really unique is because a lot of times companies not exactly forget about, but don't think it's their responsibility after the product leaves the factory gates is, okay, how do we continue engaging with our consumers to extend the life and use of our products and to help them understand that, we have built quality products that we want you to just buy one and maintain it and not necessarily, buy a lot like for Shein. So they implemented all kinds of repair. I mean,
which is fascinating because most apparel retailers, they want you to just buy, throw away, buy. That's how they get a churn product. And they're actually saying, don't buy.
Don't buy. And I think, it's interesting. I don't think this is necessarily, I mean, maybe it's part of why they do this, but if part of your brand proposition is quality, actually having things that show that you are invested in that object, that product afterwards, I think reinforces that. And the fact that repairs are free, it's like, people know this is a cost to the firm. And the fact that they're willing to repair it really tells me that they're invested in that product. So I think it's a nice way to subtly communicate the core value of the product.
I love that. Yeah, there's a business rationale for that. We stand for quality. This aligns with quality, customer lifetime value. We want to have long-term customers instead of churning customers. And then on the investor side, they took their whole ownership and made it, right? So we have three kind of starting points that they represent, the Patagonia represents. Where does someone that influences the strategy of a firm, what are their options to start? Like we laid out three here.
I'll say one thing. It's the first thing that comes to mind. I think given the state of the world and the state of sort of the regulatory landscape, I think that risk mitigation is, at the top line for this. I think if I'm thinking about having discussions with the CEO, this is something where we want to be prepared for the future. And these are issues that, are only going to be increasingly important and to get ahead of our competitors on this. So I think that's sort of number one.
Yes. Yeah. I love framing as risk because risk can travel through time. Profit can't really. When you think profit, you think this. Yeah. When you think risk, you can think 5 years, think 10 years.
Yeah.
Out.
Yeah. So I think that's a big one. I think inside the firm also, we haven't talked a bit about that. And I know a lot of times like strategists are thinking about, competitive positioning for the firm in the future, but like human capital and the war for talent, is also a totally hugely long-term thing. And I think that's something where I think much more than like the consumer business case, I think, I know from my students, they want to work for companies that have a mission, that have a purpose, that means something. And they're not embarrassed to tell their friends and parents that they're working for, Exxon. That's an extreme example, but anyway, so I think it's another really big thing as the company thinks about its image in the world. Who will come work for it is a really important aspect too.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a whole other stakeholder that we hadn't included yet: government, consumers, investors, but also talent. Excellent. So much more to unpeel. I know that you've given us a simplified few starting points of a complex system, and people should definitely buy the book and educate themselves. How else can people engage in this topic with you?
Sure. My website is my name, chrismarquis.com. Please feel free to go there. And I'm someone who, part of this work, I'm much more of an academic, researcher and writer on the topic. So I'm delighted when people reach out and want to tell me, what their business is working on and their story. So they should feel very, very, it's very easy to find my email. They should feel very free to be in touch.
Yeah. great. I love that about your work. You got questions and questions and not always. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for doing all the work for this, to develop this, for packaging it for us. And I'm sure it's going to have a huge impact on society. Thank you for being here.
No, Kaihan, always love talking to you.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our executive producer, Karina Reyes, our editor, Zach Ness, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kaihan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you soon with another episode of Outthinkers.